Adam, welcome back to my show.
Thank you, John. It's good to be here.
I know when you're introduced on stage, in public forums, on TV, media interviews, everybody is intrigued. You grab their attention right away because, you're in an area that is just fascinating. And I had you on my show some time ago, and there was a very interesting reaction, a huge reaction to a lot of the things we spoke about. But you're a church decreed expert in religious demonology and exorcism for the Diocese of Pittsburgh. You've served as an expert in these areas in training priests, deacons, and laity in many other dioceses, and were you are an auxiliary member of the International Association of Exorcists, which is a Vatican-recognized private association of the Christian faithful based in Rome. Over 15 years of working and training in the exorcism ministry, you have witnessed or experienced a number of miracles, some of which you were appointed to investigate by the Catholic Church. So welcome again. You're also, of course, the author of the Exorcism Files, and that's what we spoke about when I had you on my show last time. And I know that has done very well on book sales and got a good reaction from people who are into this whole area. Nancy Pelosi has been in the news lately. Late last year, somebody invaded the family home in San Francisco, and she wasn't there at the time, but it was her husband, and there was a guy wielding some kind of an axe or whatever, but it turned out okay in the end, and Nancy Pelosi's husband escaped unharmed. But it was a dreadful situation and quite frightening. I mean, I guess the question arises of how the intruder got into the home in the first instance. But in the past week or so, there have been reports out there of priests being called to the Pelosi home in San Francisco to bless it and perform an exorcism. And this is in the words of Nancy Pelosi's daughter in an interview with the New York Times. And the daughter was quoted as saying that the whole incident weighed heavily on Nancy because the intruder, who was trying to do harm there and was trying to do harm to her husband, the intended victim was Nancy Pelosi. And some of what he was quoted as saying his intention was to do quite a lot of harm to Nancy Pelosi, but she wasn't there at the time. What do you make of that that report of an exorcism or at her home? What do you think was going on?
Well, I think the first thing, John, that's important is to not let that kind of seem like a sensational thing. It's not really that unusual. It's not like what people see in the movies. If people are associating that with the movie The Exorcist or the more recent films, that's a far cry from what doing an exorcism at a home is like. So the solemn exorcism that people see in the movies, which can be dramatic in the sense that, they're beautiful, powerful prayers, and sometimes strange things happen at exorcisms, and those solemn exorcisms are for people. The rite that is used for a home is much, much shorter. It's only about 4 pages, and depending on how you print it, maybe 2 pages long. It only involves one command to Satan to depart, and it's not assuming that Satan is present, but Satan in the sense of the demonic. It was written by Pope Leo XIII in 1890, originally to curb the activity of Freemasonry against the church. And then over time, it was generalized and then used in any location where demonic activity was suspected. So that's not to say that they suspected there's demonic activity in anybody's home that they would go do an exorcism at. Because, John, what's pretty common these days is when there's been a very serious sin or very serious kind of wound, like a murder or a suicide in a location, in addition to blessing that we will fairly regularly do an exorcism out of an abundance of caution, not because pots and pans are flying around the room or strange things are happening, but because there's been such a grievous sin that in an abundance of caution, you want to just wipe the slate clean. So I don't know, whether they did an exorcism of her home. I don't know who did it, if it was done. I'm just talking in general. That's kind of the motive, I would say, for most priests to propose that.
Yeah, we may never know fully what happened there, but it could be out of an abundance of caution. The Pelosi's are Catholics. She describes herself, or the media have described her as a devout Catholic. Of course, the reaction of some people to that, many Catholics, is, "Oh, gee, yeah, nice try. You're the one who supports a liberal abortion regime in America."
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to her politics or judge her personal Catholic faith. I think it'd be unfair to, given she's not a point of expertise for me in terms of following her. I know she's been involved in some of that, but I kind of leave that up to God and her confessor.
Last time I had you on my show, we didn't have enough time to get into this, but it was a interesting point you raised. You were talking about demonic activity and the presence of demons in the world today, and then you went back in time to history, to the early days of Christianity, when Christianity was getting its footing here on earth. And there were the demons at that point in the early Christian church were being expelled rapidly, and we were creating this, or moving closer to some kind of a wonderful kingdom on earth. Now we're back to what preceded the early days of Christianity. We've, in your words, we've more demons roaming the world, and I suppose the way you look at it, destroying souls.
Well, okay, wait, you got to slow down there. So what I was talking about was in the history of the church, when Christianity first was expanding and moving into what Christianity would call pagan cultures, there was a lot of exorcism activity in the early centuries of that, or actually more decades. And then it would tend to settle down, and there would be less exorcisms going on as more and more people were living lives obedient to God's laws. There was less inroads for the demons to cause possessions. And so it's not that there's more demons roaming the world today or destroying souls. So there's same number as roaming the world as from the beginning of time. There's no new ones being created. It's just whether they have the kind of room to operate and the freedom to deceive and basically form relationships with people more readily when the culture becomes less Christian and stops passing on the cautionary rules of life that avoid spiritual problems. And now our culture actually celebrates the things that lead to spiritual problems. Many more people are getting into spiritual trouble. And the final thing I just wanted to be clear on, it's not that they're destroying souls, because the soul they cannot touch. The soul is God's, and God makes that judgment when we die. So spiritual death is complete separation from God, which is something we choose. We have to choose that. We have to choose to deny God and continue to deny God until our last breath. And if we do that, we separate ourselves from God, and that leaves us damned. But that destroying of the soul, so to speak, it's not that your soul can be destroyed while you're alive. There's always the chance for repentance. There's always the chance to come back to God while you still have breath in you. So the soul can never be destroyed. In fact, your soul is eternal, so it's never going to be destroyed, period. I don't mean to be nitpicky, but those are actually really important nuances in those statements.
No, I'm glad you're being nitpicky here, Adam, and it's a fair clarification, and I do stand corrected, because you did say freedom to roam in that interview we had. And I guess logically, the idea of generating more and more demons probably doesn't make a ton of sense anyway, So where are we at today? Where are we at today in terms of the demonic demons and so on? I know we spoke about it last time out, but how would you sum it up? I mean, we're reading about all these dreadful things that are happening in the world. You know, you're tempted to always turn off the TV at night now. It's so bad. We had mass shootings in California. I think there was another today. And then the war in Ukraine and everything. So there's something terrible going on that's making mankind do these things. Is it demonic activity? Is it the presence of something just really extraordinarily evil out there?
Well, human free will, our agency, our ability to choose, is never taken away completely. So the demon doesn't, outside of somebody that's fully possessed, and even then, the demon only takes over the body for limited periods of time here and there. It's not all the time. Human beings that are doing the evil acts in the world, by and large, I'm sure, you know, there's a rare case of somebody that maybe is possessed out there doing bad things, sure. But the bulk, by and large, these are human beings making bad choices, bad destructive choices. Like, for instance, and I say this with a little bit of experience, I worked in the Pennsylvania prison system for a total of about 7 years, working as a psychological services specialist. I've seen and worked with every type of criminal, every type of crime and human evil, basically that we have categories for. And out of all of those hundreds of guys that I worked with, there was one that I'm pretty sure was possessed, who was a serial killer, and another one who was on his deathbed, who did seem to be possessed but didn't want any help. So, you know, based on that, my sense is that in the world, by and large, people are just making evil choices. The demon can't force a human to choose evil. He can only propose that they choose evil. God always allows you to make the choice. So I think the greatest impact the demon is having is in the destruction of the family and the shattering of the family and of culture, so that people are disconnected from the good, wholesome messages and formation that we used to grow up with. You know, in our generation, you and I are probably both in our 50s. For us, when we were little, it would be just understood. You don't play with Ouija boards. Witchcraft is bad. You don't play around with spirits. All of that was baked into the culture. So I think the biggest way the demon is indirectly encouraging evil is by shattering the family and removing the passing on of culture. And so now people, they get their spiritual formation and their theology from their phone, from clips on the internet, as opposed to solid, complete formation in their spiritual life. So yes, the demon's affecting things, but ultimately we're accountable for our choices. And those people doing these bad things are accountable for their own free will choices.
Going back to your book on the exorcism files, you mention the martial arts, yoga, Reiki, the Ouija boards, gateways to the occult and the diabolical. I mean, it's been reported that they're prevalent. A lot of people treat all of these, or not everybody, as sort of forms of entertainment. But you think these could lead to some very dangerous things, right? You're issuing a warning here.
Yeah, it's not that I think they could. I know from experience. So I know definitively that in a certain number of cases of people, real flesh and blood people I've talked with and, met with many times and we've prayed with, that those systems have led to problems. So, it's not like an armchair conclusion that I'm coming to. It's based on experience. And then, I can reflect on the theology behind that and the cautions behind that are there biblically, and see that it all lines up. But the bottom line is these people come to us coming out of dabbling with these things, in spiritual trouble that upon examination is not mental illness, it's not a medical problem, it's not just a misunderstanding. There's real signs of something going on that reason can't explain.
Why do you include yoga in that? Some people look on that as a way to keep their mental and physical health intact.
Mm-hmm. So it's a bit of a long story, but I'll try to sum it up. So doing yoga, the physical postures and probably at least the breathing, though some people get into the meditation and the intoning the names of Hindu gods, but if you just take the physical, you're taking one piece of, if you imagine, a pie chart, and there's different parts of your spirit, of your particular religious life. So for the Catholic, you would say, okay, I go to mass and that's 25% of my religious life. And I go to confession once in a while, that's 10%. I got baptized, that's really important. Maybe that's 33%. I participate in these sacraments, I say some prayers, I try to avoid mortal sin, and you would build that up. And you might say, I say the rosary. And then what yoga is, if you took that pie chart for Hinduism, which includes diet, prayer, meditation, physical postures, even body decorations in the case of the dust put on the face, or sometimes the marking for the third eye, et cetera, et cetera. And you took this whole religious lifestyle and you just extracted the physical postures, brought them over here to the West and said, isn't this nice and mildly mystical and makes you feel vaguely spiritual? Let's do this. You're taking worship postures for Hindu gods, bringing them over out of context, and you're actually doing a fairly insulting cultural appropriation in the meantime, of which a number of Hindu leaders in India have complained that the Westerners are basically kind of, it's almost insulting. It's an appropriation. Bringing that over, and yes, if you just go to a shopping center and go to a yoga studio and just do the physical things without ever thinking about any of the spiritual stuff, you're not trying to manipulate energy, you're not intoning the names of spirits, you're probably not going to get into big trouble. But the problem is, John, almost invariably, some new teacher comes in, or there's a guest teacher this week, and they start talking about meditation and project your energy and intone this name over and over. And then somebody comes in and talks about Kundalini and awakening the Kundalini spirit in your spine. And now let's make it stronger and get you to your spiritual awakening, which when the Kundalini awakening happens, they describe the effects are involuntary body jerks and movements and animal-like vocalizations the person can't control. And this is regarded as a good thing. And people can go and YouTube Kundalini dangers with a K. You'll figure out the spelling. And so the deeper you get into the pool, the more creepy it gets, to be honest. I'm working on a case right now of somebody coming out of a very deep and global sect within Hinduism that's incredibly popular, over 10 million members worldwide. And the stuff that they're describing to us that are part of the practices are pretty disturbing. I'm not going to get into the details, but just, there's enough out there that's disturbing for the Westerner. If you just go look up Kundalini dangers or Kundalini awakening, you'll see what the deeper spiritual end of the yoga pool starts doing to people. And so, yes, if it's just the shopping center and you're just standing on your head, okay, probably nothing terrible is going to happen, but almost inevitably it gets more and more spiritual. It moves into energy manipulation, and then it moves into spirits in the body and manipulating spirits in the body. So, and then there's also a laying on of hands where a spirit is transferred from basically a leader in the yoga community through touch and consent of the person transfers a spirit to them. So at the entry point, the gateway point, it doesn't seem like there's any problems, but the deeper you get into it, the darker it gets.
What's the worst case of demonic possession that you've experienced?
Worst case. There was a case, it's it was going on for 10 years before I got involved. And it was physically really rough. And I've seen other cases like this where, obviously the person's consenting before the prayer, and wanting to be restrained if they attack other people or try to hurt themselves. It's not that anybody's abusing anybody, but while they're attacking other people, 5 men not being able to keep them under control or safe, have seen them gesture towards something on the wall and have it rip out of the wall and fly towards them, and then grab it out of the air. There was a woman, this case, there was a man bigger than me, stockier than me, not just overweight, just physically big. That was one of the people trying to gently restrain them. With one arm, threw them across the room like they were a rag doll.
Wow.
Just completely dominated them. So I've seen unbelievable strength and preternatural powers. That was probably the worst case, and that came out of satanic ritual abuse. So pervasive, horrible abuse from an early age for many, many years. And I know some people think satanic ritual abuse doesn't exist. It's nowhere near as prevalent as a satanic panic in the 90s made it out to be, but it is out there. There are these groups out there. They're not as everywhere as people thought for a couple decades there, but they do exist, unfortunately.
And what exactly do these groups engage in?
Explicit devil worship. This is not like I bought a book at the mall Wicca person. These people know they're worshiping demons. They want favors from the demons. They want demons to give them money, power, women, physical strength, abilities to excel in the world. They think they're going to get all these benefits from these creatures, but what they end up getting is used and abused and discarded when they're of no more use. And in that process, they horribly abuse other human beings at the command of these creatures. And some of those are the people that we see coming out of that looking for help later.
And you say horribly abused physically and emotionally?
Yeah, for sure.
Wow. And is this prevalent, Adam, in our society today? I know, any kind of numbers for America, Western world?
No, nobody has exact numbers. We do know that there are real cults that started, a number of them started in the late 60s. And there's a historical reason for that. Gerald Gardner, he was an English guy. He's the one that came up with the term Wicca or Wiccan. He's the British guy who popularized witchcraft back in the 60s. He kind of brought it back into the world. People thought it was just a myth out of the Bible or the Salem witch trials or something. And he basically repopularized it. And that led to a bunch of movies in Hollywood, which led to the interest in the 70s on witchcraft. And so there are some cults that arose all around that same time, including LaVey's Church of Satanism in California. There are other cults like that. The Temple of Set spun off from them, but then there's other cults that started in other parts of the United States, along with that same cultural movement, that have survived. They're not as well known, but they're out there, and they do real criminal activity. So I wouldn't say they're big numbers. These are fringe groups, that rely on dispossessed and in the sense of culturally dispossessed, like people that are down and out and suffering and think life has nothing good for them, would find perhaps the promise of security and power to be attractive. And so those are the people they go after. So they are out there. I wouldn't say they're prevalent, but one criminal, as you mentioned, the shootings, one criminal can do a lot of damage. So
yeah.
it's not like, well, there's not many of these people out there, so we don't need to worry about it. One maniac can do a lot of harm.
Yeah, that's for sure. But I mean, is it in the hundreds in America, some of these groups?
Has to be.
Mm.
Yeah, because a number of them are they cover quite an area in terms of a few states where they have members in multiple cities. Yeah.
They're spread out.
Yeah.
In not in every state, but in various states.
Yeah, I'm sure you would find some people that would say they're Satanist in every state, but most of them are what you would call philosophical Satanists, where
Yeah.
they're more just like, I'm interested in these ideas and I've read a couple books, versus somebody who's explicitly worshiping the devil and is honest about that, and is doing horrible things in that process. That's what I'm talking about there.
Yeah, yeah, sort of like cultural Satanists, if you will, in a sense. What do you make out of these Luciferian statues that have been the object of controversy in recent years? These groups putting up statues of Lucifer, in very public places.
Right. Well, I mean, and I've been trying to think about this, John. So the issue seems to be that the protections for religion that's provided for in our society here in the United States, the idea is that those have to be universal, that we don't judge which religion you can be in the United States, and that's true. You have freedom of religion. It's a core human right. Nobody can tell you how to worship God. The confusing thing about all that is the very definition of the word religion, if you look it up, and it depends on where you look it up, how you get the exact nuances of it, but the bottom line of what religion means is it's the process by which you give honor to the supernatural, honor to a creator, honor to a spiritual force, an unseen something that you're trying to have a relationship with. So the Christian would say, I'm trying to have a relationship with Jesus. I'm trying to give honor to God in the sense of Jesus and the Father and the Holy Spirit. The Hindus would say they're trying to give honor to these different aspects of God that they see as these deities, et cetera, et cetera. And so the confusing thing about the group that's put up those statues is they repeatedly claim that they don't worship the devil nor believe in any spiritual forces, yet they want the legal protection of a religion to put their stuff up, which is an obvious contradiction to the claim that they don't believe in any spiritual forces, that they're atheists. They're essentially saying they're secular humanists that don't believe in anything spiritual, yet they want the protection of a religion which by its definition acknowledges the spiritual.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's confusing.
I hope I can frame this correctly because I'm interested in getting your take. We've read and heard of reports over the years of devil worship, cannibalism, human sacrifice. We don't know if some of these reports have been exaggerated, but I know there was one famous case on 60 Minutes Australia. It's going to be going back at 10 years or so. And it created a lot of waves on that topic of cannibalism, devil worship, the demonic, and so on. So I mentioned that to put it side by side with what happens each day at Mass, the holy spiritual blood sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Both of us are Catholic, of course, a lot of Catholics struggle with that, but that's the teaching of the Catholic Church, the magisterium, the blood sacrifice of Jesus Christ. So I suppose what I'm really trying to ask you is, can we draw anything from those two striking images? One is dark, the other is pure and illuminates us. So do you think, Christ had something planned in what he was trying to do and perpetuate on this planet?
Oh, for sure. One thing that it's taken me years to really realize this, but as I hopefully mature a little bit and as I grow a little bit older and I watch the world a little more placidly from my perspective, I've realized more and more, John, that so many of these things, they are just a distorted version of what God does. And I've realized through the work, going to the exorcisms and talking with these people, it's so clear to me that the devil and the demons are not creative creatures. They only look at what God does and try to make a mockery of that. And so when you talk about cannibalism and human sacrifice and this type of thing, from my perspective, I see it as just another example of the devil trying to insult God and thumb his nose at God by doing a distorted version of a sacrifice, a distorted version of communion. And to get more directly to your question, I think a big part of what Jesus was doing was bringing to a close the age that the Jews had lived in and participated in, and that was of sacrifice to God. You know, there was physical sacrifice of animals of various types in the temple to God, and blood sacrifices to Yahweh for various reasons in the temple. And the lamb is a reference to there were sacrificial lambs. But Jesus is the final sacrifice, and he is the complete sacrifice that outweighs all of our sins. So the sacrifices in the temple used to be done in atonement for sin, primarily of different types. Jesus said, I'm bringing that age to a close. God is now going to make the perfect sacrifice on your behalf. And he is also going to himself give himself as a perfect sacrifice so that you no longer need to do these things. And so at least that's, my take. I don't claim to be a great theologian, but that's just my reflection on it. So when the devil encourages people to do these horrible acts, he's just continuing to try to get us to look at a distorted version of the beautiful thing that God has done for us. He's trying to distract us from that free gift of Christ's sacrifice that atones for our sins and get us to stare at his mockery of it.
Do you think the demons have infiltrated the Catholic Church? Because you do write in your book, The Exorcism Files, about that kind of attack on priestly vocations.
Yeah, I mean, priests are the number one danger for the demonic. So every seminarian goes through tremendous spiritual trials, temptations, discouragement, temptations to quit, to not go through with it, not become a priest, because priests are enemy number one. They're the biggest threat to the demonic. Have they infiltrated the church? Not in the dramatic, sensational sense, in the sense that the church is composed of human beings, some of which are, affected by the demonic. And don't take that dramatically. We're all tempted. Mm-hmm. Every one of us is tempted by the demonic. So in that sense, everybody is infiltrated. But the important thing to remember about the church is that Jesus promised that the gates of hell would not prevail against her, and that the Holy Spirit would guide her. And so no matter how bad it gets, and it's been bad before, it's been worse than it is now in terms of drama, internal conflict, problems. The church has weathered those things before. The important thing, though, is God's not going to abandon his church. It's never going to fall. So yes, infiltrated in the sense that there's human beings, some of which are affected maybe a little more than temptation, just because there's hundreds of thousands of people in the church, from the priests up around the world. So some of them are troubled, sure. But a lot of us are troubled out here too, the lay people. So
yeah. You write about also in the exorcism files, we didn't have time to talk about it last time, that you have experienced miracles, or you have investigated miracles. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah. So for context, the church does not often investigate miracles unless it's the cause for a saint is up. So let's say before they declared Padre Pio a saint, he's a very famous saint in the Catholic Church. Before they would declare him a saint, they would investigate him thoroughly, and they would require 2 separate miracles that happened directly in response to somebody asking for his prayers. Of course, Catholics don't pray to saints. We don't worship saints. What we do is we ask them to pray for us. because we assume that they're there with God and they have God's ear in that sense, that they're directly in God's presence. And we say, hey, while you're up there, would you ask the boss for this for me? And that's essentially what, when we pray to saints, we're just asking them to, ask the boss for a favor. Well, those miracles of healings that they require before they'll consider making somebody a saint, those are investigated incredibly thoroughly, to be absolutely sure that they're instantaneous, they're complete, that they can't be explained by doctors, and the person doesn't slip back into whatever damaged state they were in. So like a healing of cancer, they're stage 4, they're terminal, there's tumors all through their body. It's all been verified by MRI. They pray to this saint. The person wakes up the next morning. They feel fine. They can't find the tumors, and the cancer never comes back. That's how radical the healing needs to be for them to consider it a miracle. Now, there are cases, rare cases, where somebody may claim, for instance, that they're seeing Mary and receiving messages from Mary, and they might say, and she did this sign to prove that this is all real. So an example of that is Our Lady of Guadalupe. Yeah. He went to the bishop and said, Mary showed up on the hill and she told me to tell you this. She wants a church over there. And the bishop says, get away from me. And he goes back to Mary and says, Bishop doesn't believe me. I'm just, a peasant farmer. You got to do something. Otherwise, they're not going to listen. And then the Tilma miracle happens as a sign in order for heaven to prove that something is legitimately from heaven. Okay. So there's those very rare instances where the church may investigate such claims because the church, if it's validly from heaven, would want to at least hear what the message is. These are private revelations. We're not required to believe them. We're not required to rely on them or act on them. But the church is interested in those because heaven does speak sometimes through mystics and people that are later declared saints. Now, in addition to that, there are privately sometimes people submit claims to a diocese, to a bishop, and say, well, I think this is, this is something miraculous. And then a bishop may ask one of his employees to go investigate that. And those are the kind of things that I've been involved in. So, one of those was a purported stigmata case where the person thought they had the stigmata. They took some pictures of it. They sent those pictures in with a description of the phenomenon, and I looked into that. And there's other kind of lesser miracles that I've been around, like the scent of flowers filling a space instantaneously that everybody can smell. And then, after a certain period of time, instantly it's gone and you find no trace of it. There are purported healings, some of which I've looked into, not fully in depth like a saint investigation, but there are purported healings. I have priest friends that have prayed with people, situations that were pretty radical in the sense that they only had one kidney. Priest prayed with them, not about their kidneys, but about their failing health. They were on death's door, in the hospital. And not only did they recover, but they seemed to have 2 kidneys when they did a body scan afterwards.
God, the boss was good to know.
Yeah. So, these kind of things sometimes you're asked to look into in the sense of checking with the doctor and making sure that's actually what, the doctor's claiming. I know somebody who received a wound or a scar kind of mystically. It just appeared. And then on a body scan, they saw scar tissue as if they had been harmed earlier in their life. Wow. Because it was an old scar. This was related to a bigger phenomenon. So yeah, there's a bunch of those. And then, and then I've seen some beautiful things happen connected with relics, first-class relics of saints, and having an impact on people and healings. But those are, again, we don't present those as miracles to the world to be scrutinized and post, here's the medical reports, because the church isn't beholden to anybody to prove these things. It's more like internal investigations.
Yeah, and then there are Eucharistic miracles.
Yes. Yeah, and the Eucharistic ones are really interesting. So And really, in a sense, they're the most important miracles in the Catholic world, and that is when the consecrated host and or wine becomes human tissue, specifically cardiac tissue, heart tissue. And one of the striking examples of that actually happened, in our age, very recently. And so they were able to take the samples to a professor of cardiac medicine without telling them what they were looking at, and just ask them, "What is this?" And I have a good bit of the details of that in a previous book that I did, but people can find accounts of various Eucharistic miracles where it's modern situation where you can apply technology to it. Interestingly, it always seems to be the same blood type. It seems to be cardiac tissue. And yeah, it's very striking. And those often are allowed to be seen by the world. The data behind those are usually presented to the world because it's seen as a sign for the world, not just for the believers in the church, though it does help them because many people don't believe in the Eucharist, but it's seen as a sign just for the whole world, as an encouragement for people.
Just going to quickly divert. Back in the 1980s, in Ireland, just after I had left, or around that period, I grew up in Ireland. There was a very interesting phenomena taking place, and it was the subject of awe and some ridicule, but nobody proved or disproved, although some people thought the seers were losing their minds or their grip on themselves. But it was the phenomena of moving Marian statues throughout Ireland.
Oh,
And I don't know if you ever came across that, Adam, but
yeah.
it was widely reported at the time, and then it just disappeared. But people would gather in the evening and pray at the Marian shrines, and many of them would report seeing, the statue moving, and the phenomena eventually disappeared. But some years later, I believe it was on one of the anniversary dates, some television company interviewed some of the people who claimed they saw the statues moving, and they recounted their details in very precise details, and stood by their testimony. Yes, the statue moved. It was awe-inspiring, was beautiful. I was uplifted. I was in some kind of a extraterrestrial zone or whatever. We don't know what the truth was. I don't believe there was ever any church investigation, but it was fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a case of what seemed to be Mary appearing on the top of a Coptic church over in Egypt. I believe this was in the 70s, and it went on and it's been a while since I read the story, but it went on for more than a month, and it was a nightly occurrence, and the government that was pretty opposed to the Coptic Christian people even went so far as to cut all the power in that whole region of the city, because thinking it was a projector or some type of special effect being used. And hundreds of thousands of people gathered night after night to watch this figure of Mary walking around on the church roof. And that was well documented, but a lot of the footage of it, I mean, you can still see the footage. You can find it on YouTube. It's, I believe, Zaytun was the city. But that one was interesting in the sense that, the footage still survives.
Yeah. Well, we're almost out of time, Adam. What's your caseload like at the moment? Are you kept busy?
Yeah, we do sessions every Friday. So currently we're working with 4 people, and I have many other cases that are lesser, that aren't full possession, that I kind of farm out to our priests and give them advice and help those people too.
Yeah, but you're not an exorcist, so to be very
No,
clear about this, correct? What's your role in all of this?
I'm a lay person, so I cannot do solemn exorcisms. That's only a priest with permission from the bishop. I'm essentially a coach and a teacher.
Hmm.
So I help train new exorcists that are coming up. We have a number that visit us every Friday from neighboring dioceses, and we help teach them. I also teach at conferences, clergy days sometimes, the Pope Leo XIII Institute, and I'm traveling to South America and the Far East this year, to train in various places.
Well, always great having you as my guest. I learned so much and you give me lots to think about, so much so that I have to have you back again to ask follow-up questions. And we'll do that, Adam. And in the meantime, take care.
You too, John. God bless you.
God bless you. Okay.